Hi, I'm City Manager Bill Osborne in Douglasville, and this is another edition of On the Agenda. February being Black History Month, for the second edition of this program, we intend to focus on Black history. In our earlier program, I talked with Lonnie King, who was a leader in the student sit-in movement some 50 years ago. Today, I will be talking with two local residents, ladies who live in Douglasville, who will have an interesting information to share with you. The first of these will be Councilwoman Callye Burke Holmes, who will be talking about Jakata, the Jazz Museum, and what she's doing to emphasize Black history. And my second guest will be Gwen Redwine, who is writing a book on Black history in Douglas County. I hope you will enjoy today's edition of On the Agenda. Well, welcome back to On the Agenda. My special guest at this time is one of my bosses, a member of the City Council, Councilwoman Callye Burke Holmes. Welcome to On the Agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. It's very good to be your guest.
And we want to start we'll be talking about Jakata. Tell us, what does the word Jakata mean?
Well, Bill, Jakata stands for Jewel of Celebrated Artistry Displayed Always. So rather than have that long sprawl on the business letterhead and brochures, we made it short. And Jakata Museum of Jazz started out by remembering all of the jazz musicians that I worked with, that we came across the many, many venues of jazz, and through education and my music classes and music lessons, and we just wanted to pay tribute to that era.
Right. When you and I talked about Black History Month and the observance of Black History Month through what we would do on City TV, one of the things that we talked about is including in that on the agenda program attention to Jakata, being the Museum of Jazz, and jazz being, of course, that unique music sound that grew out of the African American community, and of course you've done a lot in calling to the attention of the Metro Atlanta area, certainly the history of jazz. And also one of my guests that I've had here on the agenda, Lonnie King, who led the sit-in movement in Atlanta some 50 years ago, which was an important part of the civil rights movement in the South. And I appreciate you making contact with Mr. King to have him be a guest on the show. But in terms of Jakata and the Jazz Museum, what interested you in starting the Jazz Museum, and how did it ended up in downtown Douglasville?
A long journey. Jakata is now a 40-year-old dream turned reality. Don't start adding my age. Thank you very much. Jakata started with myself and two other members in the community in New England, where we would travel any place and every place where there was live jazz. Newport, Rhode Island, New York, the Bronx, we would travel. We were young teenagers, and we were the kind, we call ourselves groupies, because we were there passing out all the information, trying to talk about jazz, motivate folks to come and support all the concerts that were going on. And Diana Wimbish and myself and Justine Dodson, we were known as the Jazz Preservation Group. And Diana, bless her heart, she's a cancer survivor, so she sort of backed out. And Justine took care of her family, her parents. She had her father was very ill at the time. But Justine was a collector of jazz albums. Diana was more on the jazz venue, promoter of jazz venues. And I stood more for the educational aspects. As we grew up, we continued our journey with supporting various jazz artists at jazz venues. And we looked at California, we looked at Michigan, we looked at South Carolina, we looked at parts of Florida. because we really wanted to take the educational aspects of the jazz era and maybe just pay tribute because jazz is America's truest art form. Mm-hmm. In the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, when African Americans had to enter from the rear of the jazz venue, not allowed to enter through the front door, they were still the most sought after jazz artists, bringing grave reviews nationally and internationally. So we wanted to take that aspect of jazz education and bring it to a venue, an establishment, an educational center so that people could learn more about it. And thus, the Jakata Museum of Jazz was birthed.
Right, very good. Well, for our viewers who have an interest in seeing what the Jakata Museum has, including the new Black History feature that you've added, it's located, of course, in downtown Douglasville in the old Douglas County Courthouse. And if somebody wanted to visit the museum, what are the hours of operation and how does it work to be able to go see the exhibits?
Well, if I could back up just a little bit, the concept of being in downtown Douglasville started in 1997 when we were looking at the Smith-Dabbs building then. Mm-hmm. And I think we had talked to you, we had a little support. My very dear friend, the late Linwood James from Greystone Power, and Tony Gilpin, and a few of the community leaders in Douglasville. We were trying to find a location for this site, and the Tourism and History Commission of Douglas County was kind enough to show us some space at the old courthouse building. Right. So we are now housed at the old courthouse building. We've been there since May 17th, 2002, had our grand opening in February of 2003 with the first big band, live big band jazz coming to Douglasville, 32-piece orchestra. And we are currently open with regular business hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1 to 5. But we have tours all the time, 24/7 by appointment, and we also do group tours.
Okay, and if one of our viewers was interested in a group tour, how do they get in touch with you?
You can call Jakata Museum at 770-947-1187, 770-947-1187. Okay.
Now let's make the connection, if we can, between the Jazz Museum and what you've got on exhibit and Black History Month, which we're calling attention to.
Well, Bill, the Jakata Museum of Jazz, we knew in 2005 that we might want to include Black history because, frankly, the Renaissance era of jazz really took off amongst the Black artists. So we would like to merge, and we had our board meeting and we made the decision, okay, maybe now's the time to go ahead and start including some of the Black history memorabilia that we have been receiving, because if you don't put it up and display it, the families are going to want it back.
Right.
But we have had so much in storage that we're overflowing, and we are limited in space at the old courthouse building. So this is a merger now to take what we know as the Renaissance era during the Cotton Club era, the early 20s, and we want to take that and transition that jazz history to also include jazz in other parts of the world. The African continent has jazz. So we are featuring some of the jazz music from some of the African jazz artists as well. And we're interpretive in our nature to also have, I'm giving away the surprise, but to also have displays that are representative of that time. But we really, there is no stopping point to say that jazz is only amongst the Black community. But we certainly appreciate and remember those artists in the jazz community from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s who have made significant contributions to music and jazz. So we're going to take it and transition and merge a little bit more Black history and feature some of those photos. For instance, Jim Alexander is an Atlanta photojournalist, and he actually traveled with Ella Fitzgerald, Carmen McRae, Art Farmer, Sammy Davis, and his pieces are on display at the museum. We have Duke Ellington, a photo with U.B. Blake, Dizzy Gillespie. There's quite a few jazz artists in that photo that we would like to that will be on display and featured during Black History Month. And Black history is not just for the Black culture. Black history is for everyone. And we have a lovely artist, her name is Susan Gardner, and she has an exhibit of John Coltrane, Pete Fountain, who was big in the Dixieland music era, and her pieces are being featured as well. We have an enormous amount of Black magazine publishings that show Duke Ellington and Sammy Davis, so we're really excited about it, and we're hoping that the community will come out and support us as we transition from the Jakata Museum of Jazz to the Jakata Museum of Jazz and African American History.
Right, and I know our City of Douglasville Convention and Visitors Bureau, one of the items that they identify when they're talking about an itinerary for visitors to Douglasville is the Jakata Museum of Jazz is one of the key features that we have, because it is unique, and I think as it gets more and more attention, we'll have more and more people who are interested in it. And you've touched on a number of people very famous in jazz, but I know that you're more than just a historian of jazz. I know that you've been a jazz singer. So tell us about how you became a jazz singer and some of the things you did during that part of your life.
I sang through church, of course, in the choir, BYF youth club at our church, and also in school, in drama. And I started singing in the school chorus and band practice, and I guess it got in my blood because music is very therapeutic, and it's an expression of passion and life. It's a lifestyle. My largest contribution to being devoted and committed to jazz music was during my time singing with the Johnny Trudell Big Band Orchestra, a 62-piece band. And I learned a lot more about how intricate the pieces, all pieces of the instrumentation, as well as the composition of the song, had. Every piece is so important. And I love that big band sound. So it's in my blood. I think that's what happened. I went from country music, R&B, pop, and jazz has been my choice since 20, 30 years ago.
Well,
we won't talk about age.
That's great. Well, of course, you don't spend 100% of your time with Jakata because you are a member of the Douglasville City Council in your first term. And of course, Councilwoman Holmes, for the past 2 years, you had been chairman of the City Council's Ordinances and Intergovernmental Committee with some of the changes that were made the first of the year on committee assignments by Mayor Thompson. You're now the chairman of the Maintenance and Sanitation Committee. And on the future, on the agenda, plan to have you back with us to talk about your activities with the City Council. But as we conclude this part of On the Agenda, any final comments that you want to make concerning Jakata and Black History Month?
Well, Bill, first of all, thank you so much, and I really commend the City of Douglasville and you for including the celebration of Black history. I think this is the making of history for our city and our TV station, and I think that we are showing a little bit more of the educational aspects and doing more people-oriented things besides running the city with all of the other committees and things that we do. So again, thank you, and I look forward to coming back to talk about my new committees. And you have a great day, and I invite everyone to come out on Saturday, February 16th, when the Jakata Museum of Jazz and African American History debuts.
Okay, that's great. And to our viewers on City TV, thank you for being with us from On the Agenda. Well, welcome back to On the Agenda. My special guest today is a lady who certainly is no stranger to television cameras, having been a a reporter, a television personality, broadcaster on CNN, WTBS, and WTCG in Atlanta after starting her career in Valdosta, her hometown. Welcome on the agenda to Gwen Summers Redwine.
Thank you, Bill. It's good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. And of course, we've met, I think, about 14 years ago at a Cultural Arts Council event. You've been involved with the CAC for a number of years. Actually, I believe we're the first African American to be the president of the CAC.
Yes.
And I know you've been contributing in many ways to the CAC down through the years, but you and I were very much involved in events leading up to the 1996 Olympics. Because Douglasville, Douglas County was the host community for the athletes from the nation of Moldova, one of the former Soviet republics. And also, we were the host community for the United States field hockey teams. And the organization that pulled all of that together was the Douglas County 96 Welcome Committee. I served as chairman of that, and you were the treasurer of that.
Those were some wonderful days.
Oh, they were, and I think all of us that were involved, I think, thoroughly enjoyed it. But you're here today on the agenda on a different matter because we're looking at February being Black History Month, and as I announced earlier in the program, you have spent a lot of time in recent months working on a project, working on a book of Black history in Douglas County. First, tell us what inspired you to do this and give us a status report.
Well, you know, you hear about history of other races and the history of the county and how it was started, and I said, you know, there's not a whole lot being said about what blacks contributed to the history of Douglas County, and really not knowing what I was going to find, I just said, I'm going to start with the basics, the first this, the first that, the first black city council person who was Homer Danley, the first black magistrate judge, that was Leonard Danley, the first female magistrate court judge, Barbara Caldwell, first black city councilwoman, Shirley Clark, and, you know, go on to education, Bill Jim Steele, the first black school superintendent, Douglas County, and then you run out, you know. So I called an old friend, Catherine Gwen, who is an expert on local history, and she became my consultant. And so I said, you know, I would like to get into the history of the churches, the cemeteries, you know, because that can take us back a little further. And in the process of all of this, we go to all these cemeteries. I am out there with my little camera taking pictures of the cemeteries and the churches, and we came across just a gem, which I know you're going to get to later. And there's this little building across the street from this church and the cemetery, and it's just a little cute little red two-story building. And I asked her what it is. She says, oh, that's an old Negro school. So I'm like, what? And how old? She says, well, I don't know. It's pretty old. And I'm thinking, well, it had to have preceded maybe 1950, and found out that it certainly did. And I know you want to get into that later, but that's how I discovered the little school. So now I'm running into another, you know, direction with this book that I've been working on now for 2 years. And so I started the research on the little building, and then that turned into another story, because then we learned that it's Masonic Lodge and school. So now we're into the history of the Masons back around 1920, you know, so.
Well, one of the things that, Gwen, we certainly can do is deviate from our script. And talking about this school, the old Douglasville Negro School in the Masonic Lodge, I know you're working to get that on a special recognition.
On the historic register, we're working to do that now, and it is eligible.
Great.
We had to actually do a preliminary proposal, taking pictures of the school, the rafters, the sides, the backs, and it was not compromised too much. They did add some siding in 1971, but it didn't compromise its eligibility. So we did a little narrative, as you know, in the history, and they wrote back and said, yes, it's eligible. Now proceed with your research, and that's what we're doing now.
Very good. Well, as you've been working on your book, tell us about a couple of fascinating individuals or situations that you've come across.
Jesse Davis Sr., for whom the park is named. was just an extraordinary individual. I met his son, Jesse Davis Jr., who it's an entire chapter on Jesse Davis Jr. and Sr. and the Douglasville Pros baseball team.
Right.
They were one of the winningest baseball teams back during this. It was like the end of the old Negro Baseball League era. And they desegregated baseball when they joined the Josh Gibson Baseball League. And as a result, they were able to now play white teams around the state of Georgia. And they ended up upsetting the state champs, the Valdosta Indians of all teams. We have a photo of that Douglasville Pros team. It was a good-looking group of guys. Alton Caldwell, who was on the city council.
Yes,
I think it was the second African-American elected to the city council. He was a member of that team. Harvey Jones, who was the first black mayor pro tem. He was on that team. Terry Harper, who later went on to become a player with the Atlanta Braves, was the water boy. And that is Barbara Caldwell's little brother, Terry Harper. So it's a lot of history, you know, in that, just in that photo alone. And there are other local members of that team that have some history as well in Douglas County, which we'll go into a little bit more detail in the book. But that was just something I found fascinating. Bill Fite, who was Woody Fite's, is Woody Fite's husband. Woody Fite passed recently, coached along with Jesse Davis Sr. when the teams were, when the league was desegregated. They were very good friends. And even before, their teams would play each other. And so that was a very interesting relationship the two of them had, and we talk about that too in the book. And I've spoken to Bill, and he speaks fondly of Mr. Davis, but Mr. Davis was a great man, and he kept a lot of those boys out of trouble, and all those kids went on to lead very productive lives. Even though he did die prematurely, you know, of lung cancer.
Well, you know, with the work that you're doing on this book, not sure what your target date is for publication, but certainly when you get close to that
when I'm
date,
through.
we want you to come back on the agenda so we can talk about the finished product. But you mentioned Jesse Davis, another one or two people that back in the past that you've really found intriguing as you've done your research.
Well, Mr. Heinzman, John Heinzman, is Miss Catherine Wynn's brother, one of her older brothers. He was a World War II veteran, grew up here in Douglas County. I'm so glad she had me interview him because he knew of things that she had forgotten because he's a little older. They grew up on the David T. Howard plantation here in Douglas County. Now, you being from Atlanta and around those parts, you may know David T. Howard's name as a great African-American philanthropist and educator, and he was a good friend of Maynard Jackson's father,
Used to be a Howard High School in Atlanta.
Yeah, it's named after David T. Howard. Well, he owned 50 acres or 100 acres of land in Douglas County in Billerica, and they grew up on that plantation. And he called it David T. Howard. Well, I was surprised. I said, why is that name familiar to me? Because I didn't think black people owned that much land back then. But he was one of the state's first black millionaires. And so I got into the David T. Howard history as a result of confirming really what Mr. Heinzman had told me. And I found that David T. Howard also had a casket business in Douglas County. And there is a connection between David Howard and Frederick Douglass through their mutual great-great-granddaughter, who is alive in her 60s, works for the city of Atlanta. So that's another interesting little story. And so I would like to have her come out one day. You might want to interview her one day, Bill. She's a fascinating woman. She's related to Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, and David T. Howard. And she does speak. She goes around sometimes, and well, all the time. She speaks all over the country. So
Gwen, why do you think it's important for your book to be published, and what do you hope will be accomplished as people read this book?
Well, I'm hoping that people will gain an awareness of how important this history is, and I'm hoping that they will support the Black Museum at the old courthouse. Mrs. Wynn is a curator. Frankie Morris, Jackie Hopkins, they work as well with the museum right now. They are asking the public to donate artifacts and memorabilia from the local schools in the area so that they can have this as a permanent exhibit in the museum, which will serve to educate us, the public, you know, black and white. This history doesn't just belong to us, black people. It doesn't belong just to us in Douglas County. It belongs to the state and it belongs to the country. This is all part of American history. And so I'm hoping that with this book, we will also inspire younger people to understand how to document history, how to keep logs and journals and things of that nature.
Well, this has been very fascinating, and you know, we don't have time this morning. We could spend some time talking about your personal history.
Oh, well,
you said that all of us have a history, and we certainly do, and I know that you established some first as you were among the first African-American students to enter Valdosta schools.
Junior high, Valdosta Junior High, yes.
Very much a trailblazer in television in Atlanta, both with the old WTCG, and for us old-timers, we remember that was Watch This Channel Grow. Later became WTBS, and then you owned CNN, and with some special programming there before you went into business for yourself. And we're delighted you moved to Douglasville.
I am too.
And because it's been a pleasure working with you in the past, and it's great to have you here today. Any closing comments for our audience?
I've just enjoyed being here. It feels kind of weird being interviewed because I'm so accustomed to interviewing you, and you were such a good interviewee.
Well, thank you.
You know, never at a loss for words, and so I'm just happy you thought enough of me to ask me to be here with you today.
Well, delighted to have had you here today, and to our viewers, I'm sure that you've enjoyed hearing from Gwen Summers Redwine. We will have her back another time as she works on the Black history in Douglas County. Until next time, this is City Manager Bill Osborne signing off from On the Agenda. I hope you enjoyed the special programming which City TV did on Black History Month. I know that you enjoyed the programming by Mayor Pro Tem Henry Mitchell, Councilwoman Callye Burke Holmes. I hope you enjoyed the On the Agenda programs. If you remember in talking with Gwen Summers Redwine, she mentioned several local people, and some of those, of course, Mayor Pro Tem Mitchell had on his program that you have seen. We'll have others of those individuals appearing on City TV during the year. Have a great day, and join us always on City TV.